Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming here. Blessed Easter Sunday to all of you who celebrate. So today what we're going to do is we're going to be launching our campaign manifesto. And there's been a lot of talk about manifestos, whether they're too long, too short, too full of generalities. But I'm going to tell you that our manifesto is tied in very closely with our campaign slogan and our campaign theme. And I can also tell you that the campaign manifesto is a promise. And it's a promise that we want you all to hold us accountable to. Our campaign manifesto illustrates the 6 major areas that we will be focusing on, and that you can be assured that an SDP MP will raise a question on each of these 6 areas before too long if we get elected into Parliament. So let me begin. So as you heard yesterday, our campaign slogan is Thrive, T-H-R-I-V-E, and conveniently, each of these letters stands for one of the key elements of our manifesto. The first is T. Now, T stands for taxation. And what we're asking for is for taxation that is fair and equitable to everyone. We have long called for a decrease in the GST. In fact, we even called in the 2020 election for a temporary hold on the GST. What we cannot believe is in a time of global inflation that the PAP has chosen to raise the GST from 7% to 9%. So what we're saying is at the very least, bring the GST back down from 9% to 7%. Now you've seen the FY 2025 budget, and that projects a surplus of $6.41 billion. What a surplus means, when a government runs a surplus, it basically means they collect more from taxpayers than they actually spend on services and things that they provide for the taxpayer. So in other words, the government is telling us it's collecting in excess $6.41 billion. If they were to reduce the GST from 9% to 7%, that we would still have a surplus, and the surplus would be $1.83 billion. Now, any government in the world that's looking at a surplus of $1.83 billion will be asked the question, why are you collecting so much money from your citizens? So that's number one. And you can be sure that SDP MPs in Parliament are going to ask the question as to why we need to have a $6.41 billion surplus for FY 2024, and whether there could be a more equitable way of distributing revenue generation, reducing GST, which hits the poor the hardest as a proportion, and instead of which looking at wealth taxes, which many of the other alternative parties have talked about. So that's the T. H is healthcare. Healthcare is an issue which is closest to my heart because I've spent more than 40 years in public healthcare in Singapore. Now, healthcare, this SDP has proposed a universal single-payer healthcare insurance scheme. And we proposed this way back in 2012 when we wrote a very detailed healthcare policy. What was interesting was, at that time, the PAP said the policy was unsustainable. It was not a good idea to cover pre-existing illnesses. Because remember, before 2011 general election, MediShield could not be used for pre-existing illnesses such as diabetes or cancer. After the general election, when the voters of Singapore sent a message to the PAP, our healthcare policy was there in place, and suddenly the PAP's objections to covering pre-existing illnesses disappeared. And that's because of the message that was sent by the voters. And so now MediShield Life covers pre-existing illnesses. That is an improvement. However, there are still very high deductibles. There's a $3,000 deductible, so that effectively excludes most of the subsidized hospitalization. In addition, the private healthcare sector in Singapore costs have spiraled completely out of control. There are third-party administrators which have come in, clinics and practices are being bought over by venture capitalists and hedge funds, so something clearly needs to be done to rein in healthcare inflation. So the H stands for healthcare for all. The next is R. So R stands for respect. And we call for respect for our environment, for our climate. You know, we tried to hold this out there. It was just incredibly hot. There's been concretization of almost all the spaces that we used to enjoy as kids in Singapore. We've seen what happened to the Dover forest, the Clementi forest, and even by mistake, parts of the Kranji forest were demolished. The forests are actually the green lungs which keep our air clean, and they provide a de-stressing zone for us to move around. You know, my wife is involved in wellness research, some of you know, and many of her colleagues practice forest bathing. But you know, when there's no more forests, there's no more green spaces, there's going to be no chance for young people in Singapore to get out there. And it's not just young people's personal well-being, it's also the well-being of the planet and our city that we live in. 2024 was the hottest year on record. It tied a couple of other previous years. But you know, those of us who are going through this kind of environment, we know what it's like, you know, to deal with heat and extreme climate. So our climate change policy proposes many things. It proposes a move away from the dependence on fossil fuels, which can damage the environment, and it also proposes using ground-up initiatives, rather than trying to come in from the top and impose certain rules about carbon taxes, etc., although we're not against carbon taxes, but rather what we feel is that we let Singaporeans speak up on creative ways that they can help save the planet. And that ties in with our fundamental principle, which is respect for every individual. This is respect for human rights, which is what the SDP has known for from its very beginning. So that's the R, CHRI. Now, I is the hot button issue of immigration. As you well know, the SDP is not against immigration. What we are against is the unbridled immigration, which has contributed to overcrowding, which is stress on the environment that we live in, and also pressure on jobs for Singaporeans. So we have a talent track policy, which has been defined in our population policy, where people who have special skills, who are willing to share these skills with Singaporeans, or people who have deep commitments to Singapore and Singaporeans, to their families, these people will be given priority. And we will not just open the door to welcome foreigners whose main skill is the ability to work at a lower salary, because that cynically is the way in which employers operate. They don't feel that Singaporeans are not smarter or more talented, they just feel that we are too expensive. And so what they do is they drive down the wages by hiring PMETs even at lower wages, which is a lose-lose situation for both of us. The foreigners end up being exploited, and the Singaporeans end up finding our wages driven down. So that's THRI. Now for V, I'm going to highlight the VERS program, because we heard in the 2018 National Day rally that the PAP government was going to come up with a program called VERS, Voluntary En Bloc Redevelopment Scheme, that was supposed to be to help out individuals who are facing lease decay. Now, many of us are living in properties that were built in the 1960s and 1970s, and we are approaching the period when these properties are going to be 79 years old. And you all know that CPF cannot be used to buy a property which has less than 20 years on its lease. It previously was 30 years, but a few years ago, the CPF board changed the rule to make it 20 years. So some of us are going to be in a fix because our properties are going to be worth nothing. So we really need to examine what this VERS is all about. We've heard about it, and in 7 years, we have given no information about how VERS is going to work. And it's not just curiosity. We're talking about retirement planning. You know, people in my generation, or those a few years younger than me, we're looking at what we're going to do in the next 20, 30 years, because we might live until our 80s or 90s. And if we don't know whether our HDB flats or our leasehold properties are going to be worth zero, it's going to be really difficult to plan for the future. So that's just one aspect of the housing policy that we are trying to address. But we have this non-open market flats, where we recognize that for the bulk of Singaporeans, a flat is a place where you live, where you have your family, where you grow up and you grow old. For a small proportion of people, it's an investment. You may want to flip it, and then there are certain constraints that have been put in, but we want to recognize that individuals, by and large, the majority, still want a place to live and to bring up their families. And that's the point of the non-open market concept, where they can only sell the flat back to the HDB if their situation changes. If they want to move to a smaller flat, then they sell back to the HDB, and then they can buy a non-open market flat. But on the other hand, if they want to trade in property, that's fine. But then you do it at the non-open market level. So that's what the housing policy, that's what the V stands for. And finally, the E. E, we feel, which is the most important, which is education. Now, education has been shown time and again the world over, and in Singapore in the 1960s, as a means to get rid of income inequality, as a means to level up society, give everybody a chance. Unfortunately, in Singapore, education is extremely unequal. We have a more than $1.5 billion tuition industry, which means that individuals who can afford it, they get access to the best resources. And we've just discovered that even the DSA, which was designed to help people who have other talents like sports, is being priced out of low-income families in Singapore. Only 5% of the DSA students are actually from low-income families. And the reason is simple. You get a tennis coach, you get a football coach, you get a chess coach. That gives you a better chance of getting a DSA place in an elite school. And the other point about education is that we've heard this just recently. There was a survey published which suggests the reason why there are so many PMET vacancies is because Singaporeans are not adequately prepared for the jobs of the future, the jobs of today even. So this is what we are talking about in our education policy, having smaller class sizes, getting rid of the PSLE and focusing on developing the child into who he or she wants to be and who he or she actually is gifted and talented to be, and recognizing the worth of every individual. So there you have it, THRIVE. Taxation, healthcare, taxation that is fair, healthcare that is universal, respect for our planet and for individuals, immigration that is sensible and rational, a VERS scheme that works for Singaporeans, and education that enables every individual to rise up to fulfill their potential. So I'm going to hand the time over to my colleagues. We'll begin with Jufri Salim, who's leading the MYT team, and he will share in Malay as well as a little bit in English about this manifesto and what it means to people in the community here in Marsiling Yew Tee.
Morning everyone. So I'll do my speech in Malay. Pengurusan penduduk adalah ciri utama kerangka kerja dasar keseluruhan negara. Sebab itulah strategi yang lebih holistik, berorientasikan masa depan amat diperlukan. Ini mampu menghubungkan pelbagai hasil dasar kepada satu keseluruhan yang koheren dan sentiasa mengutamakan kebajikan buat setiap warga Singapura. Terdapat banyak percubaan oleh pemerintah, termasuklah baby bonus dan juga pelbagai grant dan skim. Namun ini tidak memberi kesan kepada total fertility rate. Tapi dengan manifesto yang dirumus oleh SDP, kami yakin dapat mempengaruhi sikit sebanyak keputusan mereka untuk mulakan berumah tangga. Antaranya, pastikan rumah mampu dimiliki dan kurangkan masa menunggu. Keduanya, memudahkan akses kepada penjagaan kesihatan yang baik dengan kos terjangkau. Dan bila masanya untuk mereka bersara, ramai yang bergantung kepada simpanan wang CPF mereka untuk menampung pembelajaran setiap hari. Dan bila masanya untuk mereka bersara, ramai yang tidak dapat memenuhi jumlah minimum yang dikehendaki skim jumlah minimum, iaitu minimum sum scheme, ataupun sekarang telah diganti nama dengan retirement scheme. Nama telah ditukar, tetapi masalahnya tetap sama. Kerana itulah skim ini mesti dimansuhkan supaya wang itu dikembalikan kepada semua, kepada mereka apabila bersara. Lagipun duit itu sememangnya hasil titik peluh mereka sendiri. SDP kini membentangkan visi untuk memberitahu Singapura bahawa kami akan melaksanakan yang terbaik dan kebajikan kami buat warga Singapura dan bukan sebaliknya. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much, Jufri. We'll take questions together at the end, and now I'm going to invite Ms. Gigene Wong to share with us in Mandarin.
大家好，60年过去了，我们一直在喝同一杯白开水。这杯白开水对我们非常好，喝白开水对我们身体好。可是这杯白开水我们喝了60年了，还是一杯白开水。这杯白开水如果时间久了它不动，放在那边就会滋生很多的昆虫，搞不好还会招来蚊子的滋生，蚊子会咬我们，会吸我们的血。身为新加坡，我们人民希望我们的政府不要一直像白开水一样一成不变。 我们希望这杯水能够有活力。我们喜欢喝 Kikapo， 因为里面有气力。年轻人喜欢喝 Milo got strength。老人家喜欢喝 Kopi O， 可是不要喝太多，等下睡不着。因为现在有很多东西他们很缓漏，没挂着困没漏，没惊起给金家雄。所以，我希望这杯白开水有所变化。所以今天我们的党才来这边推行我们党的方针给大家。回到我们的主题，这一次新加坡的大选即将到来，人民行动党 PAB 要我们很团结 ，Please stay united with us。他每一次大选都会跟我们唱同一首歌。今年他们的舞台将要唱什么歌呢？你们知道吗？就是关税。关税这个问题，不是只有新加坡有，你我有，大家都有，马来西亚也有，什么国家都有。新加坡拿到 10%， 有些国家拿到 30%、40%、50%、100%所以问题不是在于我们一个人而已，是全世界的问题。那天有一则新闻，我看了觉得很有意思，有一个部长在说一件事情，他说关于到现在这个经济很不好嘞，这个世界的局势不明朗啦，有一些关税还有其他的问题，所以呢，我们现在这些工友啦，就是成熟的工友，或者将出来上班的那些同学们即将出来的学校毕业的，可能不好找到工作嘞。我讲睇你歹勢咧 ，You are the $1 million minister 咧 ，supposed to solve our problem 咧 ，not push back to us again 咧。我们要你来做什么 ？You are the $1 million minister, supposed to understand our problem and solve our problem in advance, not when the problem come 搞不，I tell you no job 啦 ，so you all bear with it 啦 ，bear with it for a while 啦論啦very sad 咧 ，it's very sad no。所以问题出在哪里呢？我想说的就是，我们的 government 很喜欢从一些 public sector 政府部门调一些人出来咯，或者是空军的，或者是陆军的什么将军参谋长或者是少将进来进 parliament 我们来 contest。可是这些 public civil servant 还有政府的那些当兵的，他们真正了解我们这个 market 吗？我建议我们用我们的 skill future 啦 ，send 我们这些 minister 啦，将来的 minister 或者是现在的 minister 去读这个 skill future 不就有很多 study mid career change 吗？他们也需要去 study mid career change to understand our need, so make them relevant for their jobs, to do a better job for Singaporean, for us 啦。So这也能够让我们这些高高在上的部长真正的能够体会到我们人民的辛苦咯。Let them understand our problem 啦。So they must go and study skill future, the make themselves relevant also 啦。Okay, this is my suggestion. 新加坡过去的60年的经济的成功，其实是依赖着我们普通新加坡人付出的高昂的心血。在人民行动党的领导之下，经济增长往往置于人民的价值观和包容性之上。是什么意思呢？有些人听不懂，我告诉你，就是说我们新加坡人很听话，也很包容，也很 understanding， 所以我们的经济发展得很好，我们没有 complain， 我们有 complain 可是 complain 到最后也是 keep quiet 的，所以我们就纵容了我们的政府。想要做什么做什么 ，pass the law anything that they want，OK， 我们没有机会去国会去 debate， 很少声音了，讲不出来了，所以就造成了我们现在这个局面，导致我们的生活成本的加剧，我们过度的依赖外籍的人员，让我们的人口飞速的增长，搞得我们人民的日子苦不堪言。新加坡民主党提出了一个大胆 以人为本的替代方案。它不仅注重经济发展，也要惠及新加坡人民的利益。其原则侧于是建立一个更加平等、公正、可以持续的经济，把我们的利益放在国家之上。只有我们人民幸福了、开心了，才能说我们是个幸福指数好的国家。今天我们民主党的宣言围绕着几个议题。第一是税收，我们希望能够减少 GST， 来帮助人民真正的减轻负担。还有在我们的医疗方面，也能够帮助到大家，因为政府一直说我们的医疗费很贵，到底贵在哪里？为什么会那么贵？上个月我爸进医院，住了个 Class C 的 ward。Class C 啊，在 A&E 他进去了，记得 Class C 啊，因为 Class C 有 government subsidy 嘛，所以我第二天hospital 跟我打电话了，丹作生跟我打电话了。Hi Miss Wong I just want to update you if your father stay here hospital without surgery just normal medical cost just an estimation only 19,200。我本来在睡觉嘞，我听他讲19,200，我整个跳起来嘞。What Class C 嘞19,200。Myself, I put my father into first A class. I go send him to Mount E better still. Why must I pay 19,200? Oh, Miss Wong, don't have to worry. This is just an estimate bill. We haven't give you subsidy yet. You still can use your MediSave. We still can give you all the grant. All the price is fixed by you. You tell me 19,200. After that, you tell me, sorry lah, don't worry. Calm you down. You don't have to worry. We give you a lot of grant. At the end of the day, you only pay very little. And then you can use a MediSave. I want to say, MediSave is my money leh. It's my money also leh. So by putting it so high cost, and then you say grant, then you pay a little bit. 有意思吗？无意思不？我蒙令自己啦。所以有很多政策，我们的党希望通过我们的努力，能够很好的为人民推送出来，真正的帮到大家。谢谢你们。
Thank you very much, Gigene. And now, to round up, I ask Bryan to summarize on the education aspect.
Yeah. Hi everyone, Bryan here. As a father of two, I'm deeply concerned about our education policy. Feel that it cannot meet the 21st century transformation, global needs, and it demands for creativity and innovation, which I think our current education policy lacks of. One of the things that STP proposes is to abolish or scrap the PSLE, which will actually adds mental stress to the students. The pursuance to go into the elite schools, especially going to the IP route, that actually brings about more mental stress on the students. And of course, those with better resources, they can let the kids have tuition, as what Dr. Paul mentioned earlier. Our tuition industry is worth $1.5 billion. So those with better resources, then we can make sure that they continue to upskill the kids, get into the elite schools. Whereas, those with the low-income families will continue to be at lower echelons of society. STP believes in leveling up society, making sure that everyone has equal opportunity and access to education. So I think this is a point that we really want to stress on. The removal of T-score does not solve the problem. It is actually a cosmetic change. The MOE says that based on a new scoring system, the students are actually not chasing the last mark. That's not true. There's a difference between a student who gets 479 and a student who gets 80 marks. That's a difference of 1 grade, right? And students need to be well balanced in all their subjects in order to make sure that they could get into the so-called elite schools. They, unlike in the past, where they could actually, work on you have a strong subject, and then for the rest of the subject, they may be weaker, but at least you compensate, and then you could at least try to get a so-called decent school. So I think it's important that, given a chance, the SDP MP can get into Parliament to make sure that we champion these issues that I've just mentioned, particularly the PSLE, the scrapping of the PSLE exams, and bring about a more healthy society, to society which is less stress-free. For information, Singapore has the highest depression rates in Southeast Asia. I think we cannot continue to go on this road. We need to make sure that the well-being and the mental state of our kids are well taken care of. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. So now I'm open to questions, and if you want to direct them in Malay, Chinese, unfortunately my Tamil is terrible, but we can try and work something out later.
Prof Tambyah.
Yes? Identify yourself, sir.
Yun Fang from Zaobao.
Zaobao, yeah.
I wanted to ask, so we've seen some repeated proposals in this year's manifesto. Could you just compare how does this year's manifesto compare to the past manifestos? What are some new policy proposals that SDP is proposing?
Okay, very good. So the question was, what are some of the new policy proposals? And the answer is very few, because actually we have been very consistent. And what we've done is we've updated our policies, and most of the time when we updated our policies, we focus on things that the various government bodies have done. Like, for example, the education policy. We call for the nationalization of all preschools. So what MOE did was they introduced MOE kindergartens, and these are very popular. There's a waiting list for the MOE kindergartens, and they're trying to build more and more MOE kindergartens. But we think that's not going far enough. So we're reiterating the point that we made in our earlier education policy that preschools need to be nationalized. That happened in the 1960s with primary schools. In the 1960s, we had a very diverse system. We had private schools, we had Chinese schools, we had Malay schools, Tamil schools, English schools. And then what happened was when the PAP came in, they nationalized all the primary schools. So all of a sudden, primary school education followed a standard curriculum. There was no pet schoolhouse or whatever, where you're paying $5,000 a month versus a place where you're paying $20 or I think the minimum is a few $100s a month. So every kid got the same kind of education, roughly the same kind of education, but they did not take away the character of the schools. So we had the mission schools, which continued as government-aided schools. So that's what we envisaged with the nationalization of the preschools, that you could still have the character of the schools, like, for example, the religious organizations or the clan organizations or the mosques which run their preschools. They could continue to do that. But basically, all schools would follow the same curriculum. They would have the same resources. You could rotate the teachers amongst all the schools. So there would not be this disparity that starts from the earliest level. So that's just an example. Similarly with healthcare policy, as you know, MediShield Life has come in. So we updated the policy. But essentially, almost everything is the same. Artificial intelligence did not really exist in 2020, so we had to put that into the policy. But the rest of the stuff is very consistent with what we've essentially been saying for the last 20, 30 years. Yes.
So I'm Anisha from Tamil Mercy.
Yes.
So when SDP is walking the ground and when voters ask you why SDP and not other opposition party, what would your answer be?
Yeah, the first answer is they know that the SDP is not afraid to ask difficult questions. For years, SDP has had the reputation of being the party with the guts. And so they know if they vote us into parliament, they raise an issue, we will not be, and if the issue is relevant, we will not be afraid to ask that question. And I think that is something that many voters resonate with. They recognize that, they say, you're the party of so-and-so. And they know that we are going to speak up.
So, Prof, I think Ms. Wong earlier referenced the US tariffs, right? So, could you talk about how the manifesto can offer a sense of how it can help Singapore navigate rough waters? And another second question, how does SDP envision funding, the changes to proposals to the healthcare housing policies?
Right. Yeah. So very good. So the first question was on tariffs, and our economic policy paper has a focus on small and medium-sized enterprises. So the idea is the domestic consumption portion of our GDP is very low. It's at 40%, which is one of the lowest in high-income countries all across the world. So we clearly have to increase the proportion of consumption. We have to strengthen the small and medium-sized enterprises, and that's all there in our economic policy. So, the tariffs, the way they're operating today is 10%, tomorrow is 90%, the day after is 40%. It just depends on the guy's score on the golf course. So it doesn't seem to have any logical basis. So we cannot depend on Singapore is very trade dependent, but we have to think smart in how we leverage the fact that tariffs are being differentiated somewhat randomly with different countries. We are integrated with ASEAN. We've seen that ASEAN is taking a firm stand in approaching the tariffs. But more importantly, we have to strengthen our domestic economy. The small and medium-sized enterprises, they are facing a lot of pressures in terms of rental. And Singapore is unique among high-income countries in that the government owns almost 90% of all land in Singapore. So you talk about high rentals, who is the landlord? The landlord is primarily the government. So this is something that the government can do something about. And it's something, if you had SDP MPs in Parliament, we're going to start asking questions. How much revenue are they getting from the rental in say, a suburban mall like this? From a small and medium enterprise, what proportion of the turnover of that enterprise is spent on paying rent to the government, in addition to all the other taxes, the utility taxes, the water taxes, the vehicle taxes, and all these other things which are well within the power of the government to control. So I think there are many levers that we can do domestically because the external environment is so unpredictable. So that's your first question. The second question was on funding, and I'm glad you asked that question because we actually in our policy group we actually asked ChatGPT and DeepSeek to try and fund the changes on our education policy, and it was very striking because if you look at the changes that we had, so number one, if we're going to reduce class sizes, you obviously need more teachers, right? So they worked out the cost of the teacher's salary, and that comes up to about $400 million. And then if you want to what was the other thing? Do away, the PSLE costs nothing. Okay, it makes everybody a lot happier. Okay, maybe you do something to the tuition industry, but that's not a major pain. You find these tutors going into far more productive things. In fact, we may bring some of these tutors back into MOE schools. So many of them are former MOE teachers. You see the advertisement, formerly taught at RI, ACSI, and now I'm providing tuition for your son for $5,000. So I think we worked it out, and the total comes up to about $1.5 billion. So the $1.5 billion, interestingly enough, is well within the $1.8 billion surplus for the fiscal year 2025 budget, even if you reduce the GST to 7%. So the education part, it does cost, but we think that we can pay for it through the surplus without touching the reserves. Okay, very important, not touching the reserves. And finally, healthcare. You get rid of the bureaucratic and the administrative costs. You look at this has been shown primarily in the private sector. The insurance industry looked at the CAGR, the growth rate of healthcare costs, and they found that the biggest reason for the increase in healthcare costs was not doctors' charges, but it was actually the cost of implants, the cost of chemotherapy, and the cost of administrative charges. Because in Singapore, we have these, they did away with the feed guidelines, but they have benchmarks. So the surgeons can only charge within a certain benchmark, and the insurance companies have got a lot of power to prevent you from going see a surgeon if they think the surgeon is too expensive. But they can charge you what they like for administrative charges, for the distribution costs, which reflects the amount that the insurance company collects. And those have gone up out of proportion to medical charges. So I think there are many levers that can be put in place to try and ensure. And so healthcare, we think, is revenue neutral. Our changes actually, we've done the simulations, and it looks like it's revenue neutral.
How about housing?
Yeah.
Just to clarify.
So housing, this is why we're talking about a soft landing. Okay, and when we have this change because you can't overnight change all the flats to non-open market because people have put all their life savings into it. So basically what we're doing is we're giving people the option. So you either switch to a non-open market or you retain, you switch to non-open market, or you retain the position where it can be traded on the open market. And we're not entirely sure what proportion of people will opt to retain. My estimate, again, totally unscientific, is about 80% of people would rather just stay in their flats. And there's probably only about 10 to 20% of people who are, and I'm talking about Singaporeans here, okay? We're not talking about PRs who buy a property, leave the country, and then just use that to collect revenue. Okay, they may be unhappy, but frankly, my opinion is that's too bad. Okay, if you're living in Singapore, if you're contributing to Singapore, then you have a stake in Singapore. And then we have a responsibility as a responsible opposition in Parliament to ensure that, that the value of your savings that have gone in your flat don't just disappear. But frankly, the Prime Minister, or at least the then Prime Minister in 2018, when he announced the VERS scheme, he said it's going to be less generous than SIRS. And we think that's why he's waiting until after the election to announce it. So if he gets a massive mandate, he wins 90% of the vote, then he's going to say, okay, everybody likes what I'm doing, so I'm going to announce VERS. And who knows what is the impact of the VERS at that point in time. Which is why this election is so critical, especially for those of us living in property built in the 1960s and 70s. We need to have some details. We need to have the Prime Minister be honest with the people about what is going to be the impact on the lease decay of the properties that they already live in. So the Prime Minister has already, like I said, the Senior Minister at that time, he already said it's going to be less generous than the SIRS program is. And Prime Minister himself has said that when your lease reaches 99 years, your property is going to be reverting to the government and you get zero back. So that actually caused a lot of people a lot of concern, which is why VERS was promoted. But still, VERS is a black box. We have no idea how to plan for our retirement because we have no idea what VERS is all about.
Suwei from CNA. The PAP has said that it's easy to come up with policies but more difficult to implement them.
Right.
Your comments to that?
I totally agree. And it's super easy if you try and copy somebody else's policies. Because you don't have to do the thinking for yourself. And in fact, I did an exercise, I think some of you may have seen it on my Facebook a few weeks ago, where I actually asked ChatGPT and DeepSeek, as you can tell I'm a fan of AI, but to run through the SDP policies which were adopted by the PAP and to estimate the time lag. And so these are neutral bodies, okay? Believe me, I have no connection with Microsoft or with whoever it is who owns DeepSeek. And they came up with a good list of policies, which were actually proposed, some as far back as 30 years ago. In 1994, Dr. Chi proposed getting rid of streaming. And at that time, the PAP said, oh, these are elite Western ideas. Who wants to get rid of streaming? We're in Singapore, we must do streaming so that we can ensure that the right people get the right kind of education or something like that. I'm paraphrasing them. But for 20 years, they said the SDP was wrong to advocate getting rid of streaming. And then now they've got rid of streaming, except for the IP and the SAP schools. So I think, the fact is that you can look at the data. We have the receipts. You see, so you can look at our proposals from way back, 2001, 2006, our education policy, and you can see what we said, and you can see how they've responded to it. In fact, I was looking through my mum's things, and I came across a document that was circulated by Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan in 2011. And this was an answer to the SDP's policies, including our housing policy and our education policy. And it's quite interesting to read the things that he says that now they have walked back on. I'm keeping that for one of the rallies. Yes.
So 3 questions from CNA Digital. The first, what is the national minimum wage that SDP is proposing? The second, you guys mentioned how you are calling for GST to be lowered. At the same time, SDP also talked about how hospitals, maternal pediatric services should be funded by taxes. And because of Singapore's aging population, how is that going to be done? And the third is on PSLE. If you guys are proposing for PSLE to be scrapped, what other methods can be used to assess children at that age?
Okay. So the first one was?
Minimum wage, national minimum wage.
Yeah, so the first one was the national minimum wage, and this is another thing which is really interesting. I came across this on Reddit. It was the PAP Manifesto in 1959. The number one item on the PAP Manifesto of 1959 was a national minimum wage. Okay, so at that time, the PAP was a Democratic Socialist Party, and they felt that a national minimum wage was necessary. So many people have been scaremongering about a national minimum wage. They say that national minimum wage will result in job losses. That occurred in Hong Kong, but they did not result in job losses. And in fact, what a national minimum wage does is it ensures that you have that the workers are able to buy your products. You think about it, the first person to actually raise wages on the assembly line was Henry Ford. And his idea was that he wanted to pay his workers enough so that they could afford to buy a Model T Ford. So mass production, and that puts money into the domestic economy. Because you think about it this way, if you have no minimum wage, you encourage a factory to move here, the factory exploits the local workers and the foreign workers. Who makes the money? It's some foreign business and the shareholders who are playing golf in Florida with a certain orange-faced man. But on the other hand, if you have a minimum wage and everybody, Singaporeans and foreigners alike, are subject to this minimum wage, when the factory moves here, the factory will move here not because the workers are cheap, but because the workers are good. because there is high quality of work put in here by motivated workers who are working, knowing that the salary that they get will allow them to bring up their children, to take care of their parents, and in other words, to be able to even buy some of the products that the factory produces. So that's the rationale behind the minimum wage. And like I said, Singapore, I think, is one of the only high-income countries which does not have a national minimum wage. You know, we have so many students who study in Australia, and it's amazing. I tell them, isn't Australia really expensive? They say, yeah, but you know, you're allowed as a foreign student. It used to be 10 hours, now I think it's 20 hours a week to work. So many of them work as baristas in these fancy cafes. They make $21 an hour, and that's usually enough to cover their living costs. So the minimum wage actually gets recycled into the economy, but into the domestic economy. So it builds up the small and medium-sized enterprises rather than sending the money to a Florida golf course. Sorry, second question?
Second question on lowering GST.
Yeah, so second question on lowering GST. So
at the same time, you know, you're asking for pediatrics.
Yeah. So the second question was on lowering GST. Now, the purpose of taxation is to deal with issues which are national priorities, right? So clearly Singapore has a crisis in terms of the total fertility rate. Even Elon Musk said that Singaporeans are going to become extinct. Okay, and you know, the guy's crazy, but still, the reality is with the total fertility rate that's less than 1, even in a dragon year, there is a serious concern. And one of the major concerns is the cost of maternal and child care. And so I think the way to look at maternal and pediatric care is to see it as an investment. Because you're investing in the future of your country, you're investing in making parents feel less worried. You know, a lot of parents, I can tell you this, they register in private for antenatal care. And the minute there's anything that goes wrong in the ultrasound, you know, there's some fear or some speculation, straight away the obstetrician will tell them, change to public. You know, they also ask them to refer to me in case there's some infection. But most of the time there's no infection. But what it is they're so afraid of the cost of neonatal care, the cost of high-risk obstetric care. And, you know, all it takes is for one woman to have that experience. All her friends and her sisters are going to have the same fear. What if this happens to me? You know, so I think putting money into maternal and childcare is an investment. And it's going to end up resulting in long-term benefits for the country. And like I said, even if you reduce the GST based on the FY 2025 budget, you're still going to have $1.83 billion extra that you collect rather than what you spend on the public. And the third question?
PSLE being strapped.
Okay, favorite question. PSLE being strapped. Okay, this is something as an educator which really, really annoys me. Is you look at the imbalance in the schools. You know, you look at the kids who go to IP schools versus the kids who end up in so-called neighborhood schools. Even though they've done away with the streaming and the there's no more express and normal stream. But still, you know, the proportion of students from the IP schools who get into higher education in Singapore is way higher than the proportion of students in the non-IP and SAP schools. So that has put a huge amount of pressure on the parents and the children to do really, really well in the PSLE. So what we have proposed is an idea that, you know, previously you've heard the PAP say that every school is a good school. But yet, when they're asked how many of the ministers' children send their kids to neighborhood schools, none of them admitted it, see. So the reality is, maybe about 40 years ago, you know, the Prime Minister went to Tanjong Katong Tech, which was a really good school at the time. And at that time, the system was a lot flatter. You know, the PSLE was not a high stakes. Nobody knew, in my generation, nobody knew our PSLE score. You know, we just knew if we did reasonably well, we would get through. Sure, a lot of people failed the PSLE and didn't make it on, and that was the reason why the Goh Keng Swee report came on, and there's a lot to that. But you see, what we feel is that you should have a dedicated teacher. So a teacher who follows you all the way from P1 to P3, from P4 to P6, so that the teacher gets to know you. You know, one of the things that really annoys me about some classes is that they cut and cut and cut the time. So the time that you actually have with the student is relatively limited. Many years ago, when I was in the administration in my department at the university, a friend would come up to me and say, "Oh, my son is a student at your university." And I say, "I don't know him." Then I say, "Actually, that's a good thing. Because the only students I know are the bottom 5 and the top 2. so that means your son is probably okay." You know? And that is the reality when you're dealing with very large class sizes and you don't have the continuity. So if we got rid of the PSLE, which is actually a sorting exam, it tries to sort people into those who have a pathway to greatness or going into university, and those who are actually going to have to struggle to find a position or find a place in our society, which is increasingly determined by certain technical and scientific STEM skills. Yeah.
So at least 5 other parties have released their manifesto ahead of this. What's your assessment of their manifestos, and how does SDP's one stand out?
Yeah, so I haven't read through all the manifestos in detail. The Workers' Party one is super long, okay, but it's really interesting because it deals with many, many different aspects. One of the consistent themes of the opposition parties is this GST reduction. And I think that's very clear from people in business like Alfred and others. This seems to be a spectacular own goal. That when there's global inflation going on, you raise the GST not once but twice. You raise it from 7% to 8%, 8% to 9%. So like many things in Singapore politics, there's a lot of similarities, but at the same time, when you drill down to the differences, there are significant differences there. So I think the manifestos actually reflect that.
So how does SDP stand out?
Yeah, anyone else? Sorry. Well, ours follows an acronym. It's consistent with our slogan. And basically, as Gigene pointed out, we want, as a first world country, we want to go beyond just depending on vouchers and handouts. And we want to actually maximize our potential. Because all the elements are here. We have an educated public. We are well connected. We have people from all over the world here. Yet we are still struggling. We go to this, Chian, and then people have to fight over vouchers. The police have to be called in. That's really, really sad to me. We can obviously do better. As my students say to each other, you can do better. And I think we as Singaporeans can do better. And that's what the SDP manifesto is all about. And I think now it's getting way too hot and we really need to do something about climate change. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.